All right. Yay. Okay. So I usually don't like to stand behind a podium, so I'm going to just edge over here for the web people out there in the web world. So thank you for having me and taking the time to talk about some new perspectives and themes around these issues that we're all working on. So thank you so much for hosting me. Thanks to Yaga for organizing this. This is a huge honor for me to be here, actually. Sort of geeking out on being at NCAR. It's something that I've been wanting to do for quite some time. So we have an hour together, and the way that I was thinking about this time is that I would talk for about 25 to 30 minutes and then open things up for discussion, questions, conversation, since that's actually a big part of what this is about, as far as I'm concerned, is having conversations. So that's how we're gonna go. If you do have questions, just hold on and know that we'll get to them in the second half. So I'll just start by sort of giving you a basic orientation to why I'm standing up here and why we're talking about this. You know, this really goes back for me to when I was 18 and I was an undergraduate at UC Santa Cruz, and I was taking environmental studies courses. And as it happens, I was also taking psychology courses because I was really kind of toggling between the two. And what happened for me is that, one, I found the science of what I was learning about to be so profoundly distressing, destabilizing, disorienting, and concerning for me. So there was that sort of level of trauma that was happening for me as an 18, 19-year-old undergraduate. But what was also traumatic for me and really shocking was the lack of acknowledgement and attention to the experience of what I was learning about. And so I would go between the environmental studies and the psychology courses feeling that there was a disconnect. And I didn't understand the disconnect, but that disconnect was very troubling to me. And so ever since that time, so that was in 1986, 87, I've been really looking at what is that relationship between climate science and environmental science and education, communications, awareness raising, and the psychological dimensions of that. So that's what I've been doing for a number of years. And what I'm going to be sharing with you in a very short amount of time are some highlights of where I've come to having looked at this for quite some time. So my guess is that for many of you, when we think about the topic of the psychology of climate change or climate change communication, my guess is something's already come to mind for you. You know, it could be a book that you've seen, or your colleague Jeff Keel, Susie Moser. You know, it could have been something you've read. But at the moment, we're not really starting with ground zero. The fact is that there's a lot of interesting work that's starting to circulate about this field. So what I'm going to be bringing into the mix is a perspective and an orientation that ideally kind of flows into what we already know and think we know about this. And I'll just acknowledge that I am pretty sure that some of what I'm going to talk about might seem a little unusual or challenging or difficult, not in the sense of, you know, emotional distress difficult, but just some ways of thinking that we may not be used to. And so I just encourage you to sort of hang in there with that, and that if you do have those kinds of responses, there's nothing wrong with you or with what we're doing or talking about, that just makes total sense. So I want to just start with posing this question to begin as sort of a level set. Are there unique psychological attributes to anthropogenic climate change? You know, can we say that there's something about the issues in the field that you're working in that raise new terrain and new areas for investigation for those who are understanding human behavior and human responses to threats? So I'm going to just put that out there as a question for us to reflect on and think about. I believe that there actually are unique attributes to climate change. And I know from past experiences speaking with climate scientists, including with the postdocs at NOAA, this is an open question. And we don't need to spend a lot of time actually really debating about this. But again, I want to put this out as an invitation for us to think and reflect on, is this the case? And if this is the case, what does this mean for our work in communicating, educating, and raising awareness? So this leads to another series of questions that I'm putting out there for us, is to think about, is it enough to raise awareness, inform, and educate? Now, I'm being somewhat deliberatively provocative in that right now, the majority of work in climate change and environmental engagement is obsessed with raising awareness, it's obsessed with educating, and it's obsessed with informing, right? So, you go out there to most climate sites and it's Climate 101. I just talked to the folks producing the new follow-up to Inconvenient Truth, Participant Media, and they're talking about their early thinking about this. And again, they're thinking about, okay, we're going to have a site and it's going to include Climate 101. So this is one of the pillars of climate change, what we call engagement communications, is giving people the information. Now, why are we so focused on giving people the information? It's pretty obvious, right? Because one, there's a profound lack of clarity and awareness and accurate awareness about these issues. So we already know that there's a lot of confusion. We know that there's a lot of deliberate kind of efforts to make the issue more confusing than it actually is. So we already know about that. And the tendency has been to, and I'm not saying you all are doing this, I'm just kind of generalizing here. The tendency has been, well, we need to really make a case for why this is real and to make sure people are intellectually, cognitively engaged. And what I want to suggest is that that's a very partial way of looking at this problem. It really has some deep flaws to it, which I hope to clarify in the next 20 minutes. So I want to just clarify as well that what we're talking about here as far as the psychology of climate change communications, as I mentioned, is a field that's really been gaining steam, right? So we've already got some people out there doing really innovative, interesting work. So Faith Kearns, I don't know if any of you have heard of her work. She's a water scientist based at UC Berkeley who writes really beautifully about the connection of emotion and what it means to be a scientist. She is a scientist. She's out there working with people in the Central Valley around drought every day. We've got Susie Moser, who I'm assuming many of you are familiar with Susie's work as a climate change communications consultant. And we've got all these books coming out, right? So we've got Jeff Keel's book, Facing Climate Change. For those of you who don't know, Jeff is a former NCAR senior climate scientist who trained to be a Jungian analyst and is now a full-time analyst and moved to Santa Cruz, so he's based there now. Wrote this fantastic book. We've got George Marshall's book, and are you familiar with George Marshall's work? No. Wow. Okay. So George Marshall is a British guy who runs an organization called Climate Outreach Information Network, COIN. He wrote this book that's his summation of why people are not engaging more actively with these issues. We've got Engaging with Climate Change. Probably can't see the title very well. That's a collection of essays by people who have more of a psychoanalytic clinical background, and that came out of the UK from a 2-day conference. And we've got Per Stoknes' book, What We Think About When We're Trying Not to Think About Global Warming. Any of you familiar with that? Okay, some hands. Okay, so this is pretty amazing, right? That we've got these books coming out, and I can guarantee you 100% that there are editors being pitched right now for books coming out in the next year or two that are going to dive deeper into this. So I'm in good company, we're in good company. This is a very dynamic, evolving field. So I want to just take a minute, about 5 minutes, and walk through for you a snapshot of the current landscape of how we are currently thinking about and understanding this topic of engagement, behavior change, and how to kind of get people to get more on board, right? So this is a quadrant that I developed initially for Skoll Global Threats Fund, and it's become a tool that I use in all of my consulting work because it provides sort of an overview of a lot of different disparate approaches. So first we've got the regulatory policy angle, right? So this is all, all the people who are focused on policy and who feel very strongly that it's only through policy and regulation that we're going to get anywhere. So carbon tax, you name it, that we need to have that policy regulatory angle. And I want to just clarify that all of these that I'm talking about are very important and part of the picture, okay? The second is the behavior change. So some of you may be familiar with the way that behavioral economics, nudging, Kahneman's thinking fast and slow. Basically the behavioral economists have been like getting in the fray of trying to make sense of why people are engaging more with climate change. And as a result, we're seeing books and materials that really apply nudging, right? So we've got the nudge unit in the UK. We've got the social and behavioral science team, which obviously is about to be dissolved, I'm sure, in a matter of days. So the orientation that behavior change is taking is that, it's really focused on cognitive, using incentives, using fees, using taxes. So anything that basically incentivizes and sparks and stimulates people to do something different that requires a minimal cognitive load. So default, make it easier. Put the cycle hires, make them easy to hire a bike and so forth. The other area that's very strong is the cultural messaging, framing communications, right? And this is really focused on if we frame this issue differently and better, we're going to get more engagement. Okay, so values-based messaging, Katherine Hayhoe, I would say kind of falls into this, where we're really being creative about connecting with where people are in terms of their faith, their values, their ideology, and so forth. So this, as far as I'm concerned, this has right now the lion's share of energy and resources and attention going into the framing and messaging, media, get celebrities, get Leonardo, and so forth, like as if that's really going to be the catalyst, the trigger for change. And again, I want to clarify all of these are very important, but what tends to happen is that we, often sort of hang out in one of these camps for a lot of reasons, including disciplinary, it's disciplinary practice to feel that and to defend why your approach is superior. And so we're surround ourselves with colleagues and institutions that really support this. And so there's very little mixing that goes on across these. So the final area, and the one that I'm primarily oriented and based in, is what's called the affective. And the affective is really concerned with how people process information that could be difficult. So really trying to understand the relationship between affect. Affect is a clinical term in psychology that is similar to emotion, but it really is that feeling that you get when you're looking at the exhibit out there, and you're being invited to share your story and draw a picture. The affect is the feeling you have when we're confronted with certain imagery or news or information. And what I want to propose is that the affective level is one, the most difficult, challenging, messy, complicated area to really understand. And I say this as a researcher trying to research affect for 20 years. But it's also the most, I was going to say important, but it's not the most important. It's the most critical missing piece. So I really feel, convinced that if we were to understand and bring in the affect into these various approaches that we're taking, that it would actually infuse and make our work more effective. So that's really where I'm coming from here. So just want to touch on how that led me, the interest in affect led me to the work that I write about in environmental melancholia. I don't have time to really get into the research, but I'll just say enough to give a little context. So I basically conducted interviews with people living in Green Bay, Wisconsin. I was funded by an organization that's focused on the Great Lakes, and they wanted to understand why more people are not actively engaging with protecting and restoring and basically being engaged with the health and vitality of the Great Lakes. And so I designed in-depth interviews that use what's called a psychosocial method. So it's a lot of conversation and repeated interviews with people. And it's a similar question to the climate question, right? It's like, why are people, like, what's going on? You know, why are people not engaging, whatever that means to engage more? So the lens, the kind of doorway was through the Great Lakes here to try to understand more about this. And what I found was very surprising, because I had assumed that the main reason why is because people were so anxious that they were sort of paralyzed. And that's a big part of the picture, is how anxiety can be paralyzing. But what I found in the interviews was more a story about a sense of loss, that something had been lost, but that something wasn't very clear and it wasn't very tangible. So it could be a lot of stories about childhood, a lot of stories about when we used to go swimming, fishing, my dad would take me, and so forth. But over the conversations, the picture that was coming together for me was one around, there was a connection of this, what I call melancholia, with the inaction. That it was not a lack of even knowledge and information. It wasn't a lack of care and concern about what's happening. That something else was going on, where people were feeling, it was hard for people to imagine themselves as actors, as being engaged, because they were in this place of emotionally, affectively looking kind of in a melancholic, nostalgic place. Now, I think we're talking in a moment right now where chances are a lot of what I'm sharing is resonating because of where we are right now in this moment. That we now see and are more in touch with what happens when people feel that something's been lost, something precious, and they may not even know what it is. But something's happened, and what, you know, how that can lead to not engaging or doing actions and behaviors that we kind of would think would make sense. Are you following with me here? So I decided to throw out a quote. I don't usually do this, but I'm going to introduce a quote that I found helpful when we think about melancholia. So the quote starts, this is by Freud. I was going to surprise you with that, but I'm just going to tell you up front. So mourning is the reaction to the loss, it should be, of a loved person, place, site, being, or to the loss of some abstraction, such as one's country, liberty, ideal, and so on. So I wanted to just take a moment and reflect on how this may relate to our work in climate change sciences. So mourning is a reaction to a loss of, it can be something tangible, or it can be something abstract, like an ideal, a way of life, something really even kind of incoherent, but something. The same influences that produce melancholia instead of mourning, these are the same influences. The distinguishing features are painful dejection, cessation of interest in the outside world, the loss of capacity to love, inhibition of activity, and a lowering of self-regarding feelings to a degree that finds utterance in self-reproaches and self-revilings and culminates in a delusional expectation of punishment. Now, when I see this, and this goes back to 1986, it's hard for me not to immediately map this on to some of what we're seeing in response to climate change. So this might be an assertion or a hypothesis that some of you may align with and some may find weird or challenging or not on track, but this is what happens for me when I see this, is I see that the distinguishing features of melancholia are a sort of withdrawal and a sense of dejection. Now, based on my interviews with people, and I've interviewed hundreds of people around the US about climate change, from Republican, conservatives, skeptics, advocates, activists, it's kind of amazing how common the themes are that come up in those interviews. That there is definitely a sense of, often, overwhelm, of paralysis. So I'm painting the picture here, and hopefully you're not feeling too melancholic and depressed and yourself right now, because there is a way through this, but I want to sort of establish where we are and what we're dealing with here. So what does the joining of psychology and climate sciences look like? And that's the artist Jill Pelto. If any of you know about Jill's work, she's a climate scientist who does artwork that's based on her data. And so I wanted to bring her in because I'm using her images in the rest of the presentation. So I want us to think about what are some of the common responses that we imagine may come up for people when they learn more about the reality of climate change. And this includes ourselves. And I want to just say, my hope is that we can cultivate a capacity in ourselves to not be afraid or scared to look at this stuff, because in fact our ability to really understand this and look at this is the source of our power. It's the source of our efficacy. So I want to just put that out there. It seems very heavy, but it's an area that I'm convinced if we can develop a bit more conversancy in, will support our work in some interesting, creative, and unexpected ways. So I just threw out a few off the top of my head. We've got despair, shame and guilt, really important stuff that comes up. And that's a whole other lecture about the fact that we're living within systems, all of us, that we're aware are contributing to this problem creates a very unique, this goes back to what are the unique attributes, a very unique situation that we're in. As far as what you and I are trying to raise awareness about, if it evokes despair and especially shame and guilt, that's something we really need to be tuned into. Conflict related to shame and guilt, where I feel like, well, my niece tells me I want to go to Dubai, I think that'd be really great. I know she's an environmentalist, and I say, well, if you know that Dubai is kind of not that ecological, and she's like, oh, I know, but I still want to go. So, how we negotiate these conflicts and how what we're talking about invites and in some ways implicates the need to change many of our practices, what that brings up for people, powerlessness and overwhelm. So I want to ground what I'm talking about here. If you're all with me, that climate change can bring up some of this stuff around shame, guilt, despair, overwhelm. I know it can bring up other things too, okay? But I'm just really highlighting these main affects. Then what does this mean for us? So what happens when we learn new information, and in that moment when we're learning the new information and we experience fear, shame, guilt, our cognitive processes actually are impaired. This is grounded in some amazing neuroscience that's been coming out. And what this means as communicators and educators is that just communicating about the situation, and even if we try to make it fun and like light and playful, it's still, there could be the chance that people are not actually taking in what we're saying. So I'm just going to run through a couple of sort of sites around this. So this is Marshall Alcorn, who's at George Washington University. If a mind receives new information in that moment, experiences anxiety, fear, anger, shame, that new information may not be effectively integrated. I think this is a really important insight for us. If confronted with new information that doesn't fit the model, our mind relies on defense mechanisms to deny, repress, or confabulate anything to preserve the status quo. Does this describe where we are right now with climate change? Does this actually paint a picture of where we are right now? And I would say yes. So what can happen, this is sort of my little map of defense mechanisms, is that when we have conflicting desires of wanting to not destroy and harm the planet and migratory birds and organisms that live in the forest and so on and so on and so on, we don't want to create those things, but we still want to participate and be who we are as humans in this culture that depends on these practices that are damaging, creates conflict, creates a cognitive dissonance. And so what happens if that's not addressed is we can go into denial. We go into disavowal, which is to say, I'm not denying it, but I'm just choosing not to be there right now. I'm not going to dwell in that place. And rationalization. Okay, so, whatever, or I'm just going to do this one thing, China, India, whatever, all the various things that we pull out to just to soothe. Think about it. We're soothing ourselves, and our sense of kind of existential well-being in the world. So none of this is bad. I'm not saying any of this is like bad or wrong. We're just talking about human behavior here. So I'm going to get to the way out or the way through. So actually, I want to just touch on this quote. It's a bit long, and actually, I'm going to just skip through it. One of the main insights that comes out of psychology, so I had this quote, and we can share the deck if you want later. One of the main insights that's very powerful and very profound and presents an opportunity for us to think creatively and innovatively about how we translate it into our communications, education, and raising awareness is what it takes to provide the right context for people to take in information without going into defense mechanisms. So what are the conditions that facilitate our capacity to be with what is, right? What is the and I'm not talking, of course, most people in this room have an unusual capacity to look at what's going on. I'm talking about the majority of people who would rather not know. So what does it take to soothe the nervous system, to soothe the limbic system, so that we are more effective as educators and communicators in the work? That is the creative challenge that we're faced with. And that's really what I'm working on and trying to bring into the picture more and encouraging others to do. And I believe this is what Jeff is doing and Susie and so forth. So this language, what does it mean to be collectively held and born? That's a very clinical sounding term, but what it gestures to is something therapists know very well, which is that when you're dealing with people who are traumatized or overwhelmed or in distress, the most powerful thing we can do is to create a sense of containment and space. Now, this is where the translation becomes really interesting, in that I'm not talking about the fact that we need to have one-on-one, in-depth therapeutic conversations with people. I'm talking about what it looks like if we have an exhibit, or we have a website, or we have a report. How can we simulate and reproduce a way to calm people down enough to take in what is being said? So I'm actually going to, at this point, I wanted to share with you some highlights of how I'm doing this in my practice, and we're kind of getting into our discussion time, but I'll just go through this pretty quickly. One of the things that I landed on after transitioning as an academic to a consultant is that I couldn't just go out and talk about, psychoanalytic theory and melancholia and mourning. No one will hire me and no one will want me to come back. So I was able to distill some tools, and the 3 A's is one of those tools. And so these are tools that can help practitioners apply some of what I'm talking about into your everyday. So we're going to dive in deeper into this tomorrow. We're doing a workshop tomorrow morning, so it'll be much more kind of getting into this substance. This is super high level. But the 3 A's is one thing. What are 3 main things that happen that come up when we learn about climate change threats in science? Anxiety is one. Are we all in agreement about that? I hope we are. Anxiety, it could be anxiety about lots of things. But there's that kind of response. There's ambivalence, which is, I don't know, maybe, okay, I don't know. I don't know how I feel about this. I feel a little, I feel torn. I don't want to have to make some decisions. So there's the ambivalence. Aspiration, feels like a very bizarre slide to me, but, with her in front of the iceberg. But anyway, the point is that the aspiration is really about that human capacity to want to fix and to want to make repair and to want to heal and to want to show our creative capacities in response to what we're learning about. So children have this in abundance, when we're very young. It's like, the child sees that they hurt something or hit mom or broke something, and what often happens is that desire to want to make it better and fix. And so that's something that's inside of us as humans. And really it's about how do we awaken that and bring that forward. And so really the punchline here is that we need to find ways of acknowledging the anxiety and the ambivalence if we want to get to the aspiration. So that's, I think, probably my third big claim of the session, that we need to acknowledge, find ways of bringing that in to our spaces, which might sound really weird and threatening, but I believe it can be done and it should be done. It doesn't have to be heavy, it doesn't have to be deep, it can be done with humor, it can be done with wit, but bring in that acknowledgement to say, I know this is really huge, or who wants to think about this? You know, this is so intense, or, you know, when I started learning about this, I just felt, you know, all of these are ways of acknowledging the anxiety and the ambivalence before we say it. But you know what? There's some really cool things going on. And, you know, we have an opportunity, a diminishing window of actually having some impact. But our tendency is to want to go straight to the cheerleader. We've got to act now. Look at all this innovation stuff, sexy solutions, renewable energy. Like, we want to go there as fast as possible. And what I'm saying is that I think our efforts will be more effective if we create a little bit of space for acknowledgement of those others. So I'll just show you super fast. So I use a methodology that comes out of motivational interviewing that helps people become more reflective. So at this point, I'm just giving you samples of how I work with practitioners. This isn't meant to go into any depth. But this is a way of kind of becoming more aware of our tendency to want to talk at people and tell them what to do and why it's important. This is the cheerleading mode that a lot of people in NGOs get pulled into. Is like, yay, sign up, join us. And then there's the following, which is like the more therapeutic, like not pushing people enough, but listening a little too much. And really what we're going for here is the guiding. So it's a way of really thinking about engaging with people through conversation and listening. So I've been doing this work with a number of organizations. These are some of them. I don't know if you're aware that the director for ACE lives in Boulder, Matt LePay, awesome person. We're doing this incredible project right now where we're training high school students who are involved with the Alliance for Climate Education, which is a nationwide project that engages high school students. We're doing trainings on how to have conversations with their parents about climate change using these methods of guiding and listening and, you know, basically having some emotional intelligence, right? So really starting out with an interest in understanding where the parent's at and not necessarily coming in with, you know, we got to do something. This is, even though that's emotionally what we want to do, this is a way of learning how to have these conversations that might be a bit more productive. So I'm going to kind of close with what are some takeaways of how we can think about applying this to some of our work. And number one is recognizing that climate change threats are affectively charged. So that's just number one. That's what I wish when I look out in the world. This is my fantasy. You know, I wish that people working in the climate space just recognize and got that these are affectively charged issues, and that has big ramifications for how people are responding, because most people are tuning out and engaging in these defense mechanisms. And this isn't about individuals necessarily. I'm talking about groups, organizations, right, at a national level, policy level. And that we can apply and pilot well-known techniques. And when I say well-known, I'm saying in the mental health field, in the psychological field, about listening, conversation, creating, using creativity, using humor, whatever, but ways of like cutting through those defensive strategies that keep people from wanting to tune out. And when I say well-known, I mean they're well-known in those worlds. They're not, this is very emerging, what we're doing right now with this work. So this, what I'm sharing with you is very, very much at a pilot level, right? And so in a way, you know, my time with you is an invitation for all of us to think about how this might translate and percolate in the context, the highly varied context that we're all in, that there isn't necessarily a prescription. But what I am asking us to do is to think about our work with a bit more of that emotional intelligence or emotional literacy, that takes on board that this stuff is can be pretty intense. So leading with inquiry, listening for the A's, acknowledging those A's, and knowing that this isn't just about one-on-one, but frankly really could be very powerful as applied to bigger kind of campaigns. And I know I'm not in a campaigning context here, so my point is that this work can really apply to many different contexts than just the one-on-one situation. So I was going to show this video, but I'm going to end there so we have a good amount of time for discussion and conversation. So thank you for your attention.